So, 2020, not the best. And so far, 2021 is, well, it's less than 10 out of 10. I'll say that. And honestly, the last 5 years have been a struggle for me. I've dealt with addiction, failed relationships, some unsettling mental health diagnoses. But in the past few years, I've also developed ways to come to terms with these struggles rather than lying to myself about them or just ignoring them. So I thought that considering the state of the world right now, it might be worth me explaining my methods for dealing with struggles, hoping that anyone dealing with their own struggles can maybe find some help. And what better way of explaining things than with really bad memes and by quoting a bunch of dead white guys? I can't think of anything better. There are three general approaches that I have that overlap to form my method of dealing with shitty things. And that's Stoicism, Absurdism, and Dark Humor. Going through chronologically, I guess I'll start with Stoicism. Stoicism is a school of philosophy with roots in ancient Greece and Rome. The three main figures, I guess, I'll talk about two of them, but the three main figures of Stoicism are Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Hashtag Aurel representation, hashtag Golden Boys. Stoicism is actually quite similar to the modern psychological approach of cognitive behavioral therapy. So if you're familiar with that, you're probably already familiar with the core idea of Stoicism. And I'd like to start quoting Seneca because it's a really good way of entering that mindset. So he says, "There are more things, Lucilius, likely to frighten us than there are to crush us. We suffer more in imagination than in reality." So basically what Seneca is saying there is that yes, there are dangers and threats in the world, but most often what actually hurts us is our appraisals or our worries about those things. Like a test is going to be hard, and a lot of people get really nervous around tests, but then they end up getting the test results back and they're pretty happy with them, but they still suffered this anxiety around the test. It's like the worry about the test was a bigger obstacle than the actual test. And Marcus Aurelius actually ended up saying a lot of the same things that Seneca did, obviously in his own words, but the main premise is that we control our reactions to things. We cannot control the things themselves. We don't control the world, but we control how we feel about it and what we do about it when it affects us. You might be familiar with the term Stoic to refer to a person that's like totally straight-faced in an event of catastrophe, and that's correct. I mean, it's about controlling your emotions. It's about being logical rather than reactionary, and thinking about events with critical thinking rather than with emotional thinking. And there's this one meme that talks about like objects of anger and how usually when you're angry at something, you suffer more just being angry than your anger makes the thing you're angry at suffer. So it's not really useful to be angry. It's useful in the face of actual injustice, but anger isn't necessarily the right word as much as it is like figuring out solutions to it, right? Like you can be angry about injustice, but anger doesn't actually fuel your ability to find solutions. It might be the emotional motivation behind staying focused on finding solutions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the source of finding a solution. So usually stuff like anger or stuff like worrying is useless in the eyes of Stoics because they don't actually produce any effects. They don't produce any solutions. They're more so just kind of emotional responses that you can learn to carve out in favor of logic and thoughtfulness to actually make your life better. A lot of Stoics think that you should have absolutely zero emotions, and those people are, one, boring, very unfunny, and also I feel like they're just ignoring their emotions rather than looking at them, being mindful of them, but then not being a prisoner to them. And I think that's important because to be Stoic, I don't think absolute Stoicism, like absolute control over emotions, is practical or even possible. I think it's better to strive for the ideal of being Stoic, but maybe not actually comparing yourself to that ideal all the time. You should rather, you should try to be Stoic, That's it. You should try to be Stoic, not be Stoic. But the attempt to be Stoic is, I think, good enough. It's a very good middle ground. You can't ever prevent yourself from being emotional. Sometimes you have to be emotional. You have to lash out. But just trying to be more level-headed, to think of solutions rather than focusing on how you feel at that moment, those will most likely bring you back to a place of happiness or contentment more than your emotions will. Before I move on from Stoicism and start with Absurdism, I'd like to read a quote from Marcus Aurelius that doesn't necessarily talk about Stoicism, but I think it's a very beautiful observation about humanity, especially thinking over this past year and so far this year. Does the eye demand a recompense for seeing, or the feet for walking? Just as this is the end for which they exist, and just as they find their reward in realizing the law of their being, so too humanity is made for kindness. And whenever humans do an act of kindness or otherwise, it helps forward the common good. They thereby fulfill the laws of their being and come by their own. I think what Aurelius is trying to allude to here is that cooperation can be very difficult, especially with people that we disagree with, especially with people that don't want to agree with us. But he also wants to underline that cooperation is part of what makes us human. We are social animals. We got to be to where we're at now. I mean, maybe not, no, right now, I guess, because of the way that we cooperate. And cooperation is a very beautiful thing. If we can learn to put aside differences, use logic, we have to accept criticism, we have to be able to give out criticism. But if we can cooperate and we can work together, we can achieve a lot more than I think most of us even realize. All right, so next is absurdism. This is one of my favorite philosophies, but it's also very controversial, at least in the sense that a lot of people disagree with what it has to say. A lot of people are sensitive to the subject matters that it deals with, and a fair number of people fall into categories that absurdism directly opposes. I don't know if I take the same hardline critical stance as Camus does, but he does make some very good arguments. And even if you disagree with what he says, if you follow through with the points that he makes and you listen to the conclusions that he comes to, you'll see that he makes some very thoughtful and practical, useful observations about the human condition. Absurdism is credited to French philosopher Albert Camus, mainly, and his writings deal with the meaninglessness of life. I know that sounds quite depressing, but just bear with me. Before we move forward, though, we have to understand what Camus means by the meaninglessness of life, and we can get help from a different philosopher named Kant. Kant believed that meaning is a product of the human mind, a tool that we use to understand the world around us. He argued that meaning is when we make associations between things, like a blanket means warmth, or a knock at the door means we have visitors. But the most important thing to take away from Kant's definition of meaning, at least when it comes to understanding absurdism, is that meaning is a human construct. There is no meaning outside of human understanding, and that implies that the universe itself is meaningless. It doesn't have its own meaning, only what we think it means. Coming back to absurdism, Camus says that the universe has no inherent meaning, to imply there is no God, there's no such thing as fate, the position of Mars in the sky has no correlation with the fact that you're having a bad day. And so basically, absurdism requires atheism. You can't believe in prayer or mysticism. Basically the only thing that you can put faith into is science and what you can empirically prove through your own experiences. Not just what you believe or want to believe, but what you have very good reason to believe. And that leads us into the three approaches that Camus argues people take to deal with the meaninglessness of life. So the first approach, I suppose, that Camus argues is that we turn to religion. Obviously, we just say, well, no, there is meaning, and it's God, and it says so in the Bible, and it gives us control. It makes the universe rational because we want rationale. We want cohesiveness, because that means that we can, through our own ability, come to an understanding of the universe that is completely satisfactory. That means that there's nothing left in the dark, because that's scary to us. We need meaning so we understand what's going on. And it's very terrifying to admit that there is no meaning, or that we cannot understand that meaning. So a lot of people cope and comfort themselves by saying, no, when I die, I go to heaven. Things don't just stop, and I get to go hang out with all the babies with wings or whatever. And, people use crystals to say, oh, well, I can realign my chakras and then I'll feel better. Or, I can't go out with that person because they're this certain astrological sign. It doesn't really bring about any practical solutions to their lives. It's just more of a comforting mechanism. It lets them believe that there is actually meaning out there in the universe, that it holds itself, not just what we make, and that because of that, you can kind of study up on the universe, not through science, but just through kind of these intuitive measures, and come to a full understanding of everything. Now, the other approach that Camus mentions people take to deal with the meaninglessness of life is suicide. He acknowledges that some people admit, yes, there is no inherent meaning out there. I wasn't born for some grand divine plan. It was just chance, and my chances suck, and I'd like to end it. But he also argues that this approach is invalid. It makes a logical error. Whereas the first approach, believing in God, it makes a mistake in saying there is meaning when there isn't. The suicide solution makes an error in saying, because there's no meaning, I have no reason to live. That is the error, according to Camus, which brings us to the third approach, the valid approach in Camus' opinion, and that is absurdism. And it's called absurdism because it doesn't really make any sense. He says we need to reconcile two otherwise unrelated or a clause that doesn't follow the clause before it. And it's that saying, okay, I acknowledge there is no inherent meaning to my life or to the universe, but I still have a reason to live. Life is still worth living. Now, obviously, it's kind of hard. It's much easier said than done to acknowledge that there's no inherent meaning in the universe, that you were born not out of some grand design, but just because you were born, and humans exist just out of some random biological process, than it is to actually come to terms with this. But Camus makes an allusion to a Greek myth. And it's a very good analogy for explaining and justifying how the absurdist should live, and that is the myth of Sisyphus. So Sisyphus is a figure in Greek mythology. He wasn't the best guy, but he wasn't punished for not being the best guy. He was punished for trying to outsmart Zeus. So Zeus, being the fair, faithful, and totally even-tempered guy that he is, he sent Sisyphus to Hades to be forced to push a giant boulder up a steep hill every day, and at the end of every day, it would roll back down to the bottom, and the next day, he'd have to push it back up to the top, and it would roll back down to the bottom for eternity. And Camus used the myth of Sisyphus as an analogy for life, for dealing with the meaninglessness of it, for the relentlessness of life. We can work hard and mean our best, but we have to know that we could lose it all. And if we do lose it all, there is no divine figure or crystal or astrological alignment that will fix everything for us just because it's fair. And that leads to probably Camus' most famous quote, which really encapsulates absurdism itself in saying, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. That is what it is to be an absurdist, to push that boulder up to the top of the hill, to watch it roll down, to go to the bottom, and to smile as you push it back up, knowing well, every day I push this boulder up and I know that my efforts every day are meaningless. I gain no ground. I push it up to the top, it rolls back down. but I am going to continue to do it. And that goes back to his third argument, his approach to the meaninglessness of life, to say, I acknowledge there is no meaning. I still think life is worth living. I still think it's the right thing to do. I will not do the right thing just because I want entry into heaven or whatever. You do it because you know it's the right thing to do, not because of any, metaphysical or ulterior motive. You do it only for the fact that it's the right thing. Now, my other favorite thing about absurdism is the memes are quite good. I have to say that Stoic memes are pretty crappy. Like, they're informative, but they're just not very funny. But I find some absurdist memes to just be very good. I mean, they are philosophy memes. They're very niche, and you kind of have to be a nerd to think they're funny. But I think they're pretty good sometimes, and especially like there's a lot of memes that compare nihilism to absurdism for good reason, because nihilism states this, as absurdism does, there is no meaning, right? God is dead, all this stuff. But nihilists say, so anything is permissible. So, basically, there is no meaning, give up, nothing matters. But absurdism says, yeah, I know that there is no meaning. I don't care. I don't care if it doesn't make any sense, but I'm just going to keep being a good person anyway. And that way, you protect yourself against disappointment. Because if you think there's meaning and you find out there isn't, you're debased. You fall from that position of expecting there to be meaning where there isn't. But if you always assume there is no meaning, but you are a good person anyway, you have nothing to lose. You acknowledge that there's no other reason to be a good person than to just be a good person. And I think that that's pretty powerful, especially in the divisiveness of ideological and political landscapes today, just to be able to say, no, I know that, it's right versus left, and it's us versus them a lot of the time. I'm not going to be a good person to show how bad of a person they are, or so that I can gain footing to push them further back. But you be a good person because we all know that it's the right thing to do. We all know that it's right to listen to others, even if they piss us off and we think that they're wrong. It's the right thing to do to try to hear other people out. And as Marcus Aurelius mentioned earlier, it is our design to cooperate. It is our design to socialize, to understand each other. I don't like the word tolerate. Tolerate has a lot of connotations, and people use the word tolerate in different senses. But it is our duty to each other to be patient, to hear each other out. If you say something fascist or racist or sexist, I don't think I have to tolerate that. But I should have the patience to hear you make that point, rather than prejudging you, rather than making any assumptions based off of arguments you've made before. For me, Stoicism and absurdism kind of go hand in hand. Absurdism asks you to acknowledge and come to terms with the meaninglessness of life. I spent thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars on my addiction in the past few years. I don't get that money back. I tell myself it was a learning experience, but no one's keeping score. I'm not expecting the universe to come, give me good luck from now on just because of the bad luck I've had. I don't see anything as good or bad luck. Those were my decisions. I lost a lot of time. I wasted a lot of my university career not being clear-minded and not being social with my friends. I don't get that time back. It's not healthy for me to lie to myself and say, oh, but that was everything happens for a reason, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it is true that now I understand addiction, and going forward, I will be able to actually relate to people based on their experiences with addiction. It's, as someone who's been there, it's not very comforting. You don't really want to listen to someone if they say, well, I've never dealt with addiction before, but this is what I think you should do, because you don't think it applies to you. But if you hear someone say, yeah, I've been there, I know what you're going through, you want to listen to them more. at least a little bit more, because you know that they can sympathize or empathize. They understand where you've been and where you are, and hopefully they can give you practical, useful insight into how to go forward. So absurdism asks you to acknowledge a lot of depressing things, and I think that if you're looking for a way to be an absurdist, like, well, how do I deal with that? How do I continue to live my life being a good person, knowing that there's no heaven waiting for me? Well, Stoicism is there to kind of counteract that, to hold your other hand and to say, well, you can't control the world. The fact that the world has no inherent meaning is out of your control. What you can control is what you do with the fact that there is no inherent meaning. That's why I think Stoicism and Absurdism complement each other so well, because Stoicism helps us deal with the large task, the daunting task of accepting absurdism. As I mentioned, Seneca and Aurelius both made this point that we are usually frightened in our imagination, in our prediction of things, more than the actual threat or harm of the thing itself. And that ties into another thing that Aurelius said. He said, we are, all of us, stronger than we think. And that's true. And it ties into what they're saying, is that we often think that things will be harder than they are. One of the things preventing me from getting sober was just, I was so scared of withdrawal. I was so scared of going through that initial phase of it being really hard on my body. But I realized I can't change that. That's going to happen. But my fear of what I'm going to go through is just as bad or worse than what I'm actually going to go through. And once I thought on that for a few days, I was able to, cold turkey, without any help, without any inpatient program, overcome substance abuse. And so far, I mean, it's been about like a month and a half, I guess now, which I know isn't a very long time, but I overcame those initial days or weeks of it being very difficult. But once I was on the other side, I realized it was, in fact, my fear of the obstacle that held me back more than the actual obstacle. So when it comes to absurdism, saying, you have to accept that there's meaninglessness in life, just the fact of that we have to think about that the idea of acknowledging that is scary. But the scariness of the thought of acknowledging it is different from actually acknowledging it. Once you say, okay, what if I just entertain the thought that there is no God and just I should be a good person? It is tough. It is a struggle, but you can remove the further struggle of your own fear. Frank Herbert said in Dune, that's not Stoicism or Absurdism, but is a very good quote. Fear is the mind killer. And it's true. That's, I think, a very good quote, good words to live by, is that our fear prevents us from logic, prevents us from being brave. A lot of athletes and military personnel will say that your body will tell you it's done way before its actual limits. It's kind of this safeguard saying, I don't think you can go any further. But you push through and you realize you can go a lot further than you thought you could. And so absurdism and stoicism both want you to know that in these hard times, no matter what's going on, you can do it. The thought of having to stay inside for over a year is scary. If you think, oh my God, I can't see my friends, I can't go outside. I mean, what am I going to do to get exercise? What about, my like birthday party? Or, I mean, I know that sounds trivial, but like you worry about these things and your worry isn't unjustified. It's not unfounded, but you have to understand that the thing itself is different from your interpretation of the thing. So just relax, try to relax, understand that you can control how you feel about the world. You can't control the world. And then start from there. Start with your own reflections, your own interpretations of the world. And that, at least to some degree, will help you overcome your struggles. And lastly, I want to make a mention about dark humor. This isn't like a philosophically founded thing, but it is something that has always helped me. I've had anaphylaxis to nuts basically my whole life, and to mangoes since I was 18, I think. And it's pretty terrifying. I also have had asthma my entire life. And this isn't something that I can escape. I have to come to terms with the fact that if I go to a restaurant and, I always ask the waitresses and the waiters, please notify the kitchen, I've got a severe nut allergy. Tell me if it's safe for me to eat here or not, because if it's not, I won't eat. And that's fine. I'm not going to, cause a ruckus or anything about it, but I need to know to save my life. If someone doesn't do their job in that line, if they say, oh yeah, I'll tell the kitchen, and they don't, and then they fry something with nuts in it, and then they fry my French fries right after, and I eat it, I'm dead before I get to the hospital. That's it. I have to live with that forever. And I've always, throughout my whole life, I've had this thing in the back of my mind that I have to know my own limits. I have to remember that I need to think things through. I need to be safe about things, but also that I can't let that make me abrasive. I can't let that ruin my enjoyment of life. Dark humor is a way for us to dull the edge of the things that cut us, the things that hurt us. You know what dark humor is? Dark humor is the ridiculous spell against the boggart in Harry Potter. It's, you take this thing that you can't change, this thing that hurts you, this thing that you're scared of, but you put a stupid fucking hat on it, and at least you can laugh at it. It's still going to hurt you. You still can't escape it because some things you can't change, but at least you can make fun of it. And you see this in a lot of cultures in the world. In my experience, Canadian Indigenous culture, they have this kind of humor that a lot of other people see, and they think that it's really dark and it's very strange that they would make fun of such things. But it's not that they necessarily find them funny because they want to. They find them funny because they have to. They find it funny because it's better than giving up. They've got unbreakable spirits, They decide, well, you know what? I can't escape this, but at least it's going to make me laugh. And in today's world, with COVID, with political instability, the thing, we can't forget how serious it is. We can't think that it doesn't mean anything. We can't think that it isn't important to be thoughtful about and to be serious about. But we can also, at the same time as being serious, we can be playful with it. We can make fun of these things, because sometimes dark humor allows us to tell the truth and to enjoy the darkness of that truth. So that's why I think when it comes to philosophy that helps in hard times, we should remember Stoicism, Absurdism, and dark humor, because with the right discipline, with the right stubbornness and drive, we can make it through this. We can make it through anything. Human beings, unfortunately, to the detriment of like all other life on the planet, we are indestructible. We can do anything. We can become whatever we need to be to overcome whatever in front of us. So be brave. Don't be scared. And just keep moving on. Put your chin up and show those struggles who's boss. And I'll see you next time.